going to read one, but I thought I'd give you a teaser of another one that I may be able to read in the future. These two books are this is called The Evil Within. It is a book about Maleficent, which is told. So it's the story of Maleficent. Anyway, this is called The Beast Within. Wait, is this called The Evil Within? No, it's called The Mistress of All Evil. I just call it The Evil Within because this one is called The Beast Within. Bye-bye. And this is the one we're going to read today. I'll read you the blurb, and then we can begin the story. Also, big news and developments. I've lit our special occasion candle because this is a special occasion. I've had these books for such a long time. I never ever read them. But I thought it would be a perfect start to make me read them while I'm with you. I'm going to see how it goes, but I'm aiming on reading 2 chapters, which is about 20 pages, so we'll see if we get there, or if it's quick enough, we might continue on. But this is The Beast Within, a tale of Beauty's Prince. Okay. The tale is old as time, but what transformed the prince into the beast? The story of Beauty and the Beast has been told many different times in many different ways. This is one version pulled from many passed down through the ages. It is a story of vanity and arrogance, of love and hatred, and of course, beastliness and beauty. I'm probably not going to make a lot of eye contact with you as I will be reading from the book, but I'll try to engage every so often. Shall we begin? This is A Beast Within by Serena Valentino. Okay, here we go. Chapter 1. I'm gonna have it up here so we can, read interacting. Chapter 1. The Witches in the Rose Garden. The Beast stood in his rose garden, the overwhelming scent of his new blossoms making him slightly dizzy. His garden always seemed to have a life of its own, as if the twisting thorny vines could wrap themselves around his racing heart and put an end to his anxiety. There were times when he wished they would, but now his mind was filled with images of beautiful young women inside his castle. Belle, so brave and noble, willing to take her father's place as a prisoner in that castle dungeon. What sort of a woman could do that? To give up her life so easily, sacrificing her freedom for her father's. The Beast wondered if he was capable of such a sacrifice. He wondered if he was capable of love. He stood there, looking at the view of his castle from the garden. He tried to recall how the castle looked before the curse. It was different now, menacing and alive. Even the spires of his castle seemed to unconsciously pierce the sky with violent fervor. He could only imagine how the place looked from a distance. It was tall and imposing, and perched at the top of the highest mountain in the kingdom, and it appeared as though it were cut from the very mountain itself. Surrounded by a thick green forest, filled with dangerous wild creatures. Only since he had been forced to spend his life within its wretched walls and on its grounds had he done such things as take in his surroundings. This way, actually see, and indeed feel them. He now contemplated the moonlight, casting sinister shadows on the statues that flanked the path leading from a castle to his garden. Large winged creatures, more frightening than anything from ancient stories. The tutors of his youth had made him study. He couldn't recall these sculptures being there before. The castle and its lands were enchanted. There had been many changes since the for example, seemed to snarl at him as he prowled the labyrinth on evenings like this, attempting to take his mind off his troubles. He had long since gotten used to the statue's watchful eyes glancing at him when he wasn't looking at them directly, and their slight movements he caught only out of the corner of his eye. He couldn't escape the feeling of being watched, and had almost gotten used to it. Almost. And the grand entrance of the castle seemed to him like a gaping mouth prepared to devour him. He spent as much time outdoors as possible. The castle felt like a prison, and as large as it was, it confined him, choking the life out of him. Once, when he was still, dare to think of it, human, he spent much of his time out of doors, stalking wild beasts in the forests for sport. But when he himself turned into something to be hunted, he shut himself away for those years, never leaving the West Wing, left alone in the castle. Quite a sad introduction so far. Perhaps that was just why he was now detested being within doors. He had once spent so much time locked away by his own fear. When the castle was first enchanted, he thought that his mind was playing tricks on him, that simply the idea of the curse had driven him mad. But he now knew that everything surrounding him was alive, and he was fearful any further misdeeds on his part would send it into a frenzy, and his enemies would make him suffer even more for the pain he had caused so many before he became a beast. The physical transformation was only part of the curse. There was much more, and it was far too frightening to think of. Right now, he wanted to think the only thing that could calm him, even slightly. He wanted to think of her, Belle. He looked upon the lake to the right of the garden, the moon creating beautiful silver patterns on the rippling water. Apart from his thoughts of Belle, this was the only tranquility he had been afforded since the curse. He spent many hours here, careful not to catch sight of his own reflection. Relatable. Though sometimes he was tempted, he was fully aware of the revulsion it would bring. Revulsion is not a word I've heard before. He had almost been obsessed with his reflection when the curse began to take hold, and he quite liked the little changes in his appearance at first. The deep lines, he mused, had made his young face more fearsome to his enemies. But now that the curse had overtaken him completely, he couldn't stand the sight of himself. Every mirror in the castle had been broken or shut away in the West Wing. His terrible deeds were now engraved upon his face, and that sent a hollow, wretched feeling deep into his gut, sickening him. But enough of that. He had a beautiful woman within his walls. She was a willing captive, someone to talk to, and yet he couldn't even bring himself to face her. Fear, it gripped him again. Would his fear now keep him outside, where once it had shut him in? Fear of going within doors and facing that girl. She was a wise woman. Had she no idea his fate was in her hands? The statues watched, as they always did, when he heard the click of tiny boots on the stone path, heading in his direction, disturbing his musing. The old sisters, Lucinda, Ruby, and Martha, an indistinguishable trio of witches with inky black ringlets, a milky pallor with the texture of bleached driftwood, and red baby doll lips, were standing before him in his rose garden, their faces glowing in the moonlight like those of ghosts with mocking expressions. Their finery glittered like stardust in his dark garden, while the plumage in their hair made the bird-like gestures all the more grotesque. There were nervousness about them. They were seized by a consistent series of little twitches and gestures, as if they were in continuous communication with each other when they weren't even speaking. They seemed to be taking measure of him, and he let them. He stood in silence, as he often did when they came to him, waiting for them to speak. They appeared whenever they pleased, and always without warning. Never mind, it was his castle and his gardens. He had long before given up on insisting that they will appear at his will. He soon divorced his own desires, as they were no consequence to them. Their laughs were shrill and seemed to mock the tiny glimmer of hope the witches detected within the dark and lonely heart of the beast. Lucinda was the first to speak, as was their custom. He couldn't help being transfixed by her face when she spoke to him. She looked like an odd doll came to life, with her porcelain skin and ratty clothes. Her unfaltering monotone voice only made the scene more macabre. "So, you've captured yourself a pretty little thing, at long last." He didn't bother asking how they knew Belle had come to the castle. He had his theories on how they would always seem to know everything about him, but he didn't care to share with them, with the sisters. So far, this is a little bit different than the movie. I don't know these witches. "We're surprised, beast," said Martha, her pale blue eyes watery and globe-like. "Yes, surprised," Ruby spat with an eerie wide grin animating her two red lips morbidly, like a dead creature brought to life with evil incantations. "We expected your condition to have progressed by now," said Lucinda, her head cocked slightly to the right while she looked at him. "We dreamed of you running into the wood, hunting smaller prey," Ruby continued. "We dreamed of hunters tracking you down." Martha laughed and said, "Hunting you like the beast you are and mounting your head on the huntsman's tavern wall. Why, you're even wearing clothes, we see. Holding on to your last shred of humanity, is it?" They all said in unison. The beast did nothing to betray his terror. Terror not of the witch's magic, but of his own threatening nature, of which they were reminding him of. They were holding a mirror up to the monster within, which he was longing to escape. It was a beast that wanted to kill the witches and everything else in its path. He longed to see blood and bones, to taste their flesh. If he tore at their throats with his claws, he'd never have to listen to their shrill, taunting voices again. Lucinda laughed. "Now that is what we expected of you, beast." And Martha said, "He will never capture Belle's heart, sister, no matter how desperate he is to break the curse. He's gone too far now, I dare say. Perhaps if he showed her how he once looked, she may have pity on him," Ruby said, as a maddening cacophony of laughter filled the rose garden. "Pity him, yes, but love him, never." The beast used to hurl up insults back at them, but it seemed only to fuel their passion for cruelty, and he didn't dare to stir up his own anger and desire for violence. So he just stood stock still, waiting for their little torture session to end. Martha spoke again. "In case you've forgotten, here are the rules, beast, laid out by all the sisters. You must love her, and that love must be returned with a true love's kiss before your 21st birthday. She may use the mirror as you do, to see into a world beyond your kingdom, but she must never know the details of the curse, or how it is to be broken. You will notice that she sees the castle and its enchantments differently from you. The most terrifying aspects of the curse are reversed for you." The beast stared blankly at the witches. Martha smiled creepily and continued, "This is one of your advantage. The one thing this castle, or on its grounds, that will little frightened bell is your visage. Lucinda chimed in. When was it the last time you looked upon your reflection, beast, or saw to that rose? There had been a long time when the rose wasn't out of his sight. Lately he tried to forget it. He almost expected the sisters to visit this evening would be to inform him that the last petal had fallen off its enchanted stem. But they were just here to mock him, as always, to tempt him into violence. They'd love nothing more than to see the soul further besmirched. Lucinda's cackling voice brought him out of his reverie. It won't be long now, Martha continued. Not long at all, beast. Soon the last petal will fall, and you shall remain in this form with no chance of transformation to your former self. And on that day we will dance. They finished in unison. The beast finally spoke. And what of the others? They remain as they are, doomed to enchantment as well. Ruby's eyes widened in wonder. Concern, is it? Is that what we detect? Isn't that odd? Concern for himself. Yes, for himself, always himself, never others. Why would he concern himself with servants? He never gave them a second thought, unless it was to punish them. I think he's afraid of what they might do to him if he doesn't break the curse. I think you're right, sister. I am also interested in seeing what they'll do. It shall be a gruesome spectacle indeed, and we shall take as much pleasure in bearing witness to it. Don't forget, beast, true love both given and received before the last petal falls. And with that, the sisters turned on the heels of their tiny pointed boots and clicked their way out of the rose garden, the sound of fading little by little until they vanished into a sudden mist, and the beast could no longer hear them at all. Whoa. Okay, that's chapter 1 all completed, and I'm hopefully never going to have to do that whispered English accent ever again. I think I might go ahead and do the second chapter, even though, so it's only 7 pages, 20. Chapter 2 is up to page 20, so it's a short one. And I think we will continue. Chapter 2 is called The Refusal. The beast sighed and slumped down on the stone bench in the shadow of the winged creature statue hovering above him. Its shadow mingled with his own, his face and its wings merging into what looked like a she-dew, the winged lion from an ancient myth. It had been so long since he even looked at his shadow that he hardly knew what he looked like, and this shadow stirred a great interest with him. With an infusion of light, the shadow faded into nothingness. Remaining was a new, stark white statue, wearing a passive expression. It was neither male nor female, not that he could surmise anyway. And it was standing completely still with a small brass candelabrum on one hand, candles burning while the other hand pointed towards the castle entrance. It was as if the stone figure was commanding him back to the castle, back into the gaping mouth. He feared, if he returned, the castle would at last devour him. He made his way back, leaving the silent statue and the sisters' taunting words in the garden. The light from the candelabrum looked tiny now, like fireflies in the distance. The statue would make its way back to the castle in its own time, more than likely when the beast was far enough away. They never moved or came to him while he was looking at them directly. They were always sneaking up on him, while his attentions were elsewhere. It frightened him. Really, to know they could come up to him at any time and do with him what they would. But this was yet another portion of the curse he had to contend with. He thought about what the sisters had said and wondered how Belle saw the castle's enchantments, and how it cursed servants would appear to her. As he made his way through the foyer towards the dining room, he stopped to listen to the muted voices coming from Belle's chamber, but couldn't quite make out what was being discussed. He was creeping down the hallway, hoping to get a peek at whom she was speaking to, when he heard a gentleman with a French accent, inviting her to dine. She slammed the door and refused. I won't do anything with him. He's a monster. Monster? His anger got the better of him. If she won't dine with me, she won't dine at all. We all know that scene. If you've seen the movie, if you haven't seen the movie, you don't know that scene. He growled, turning to the corner, and half expecting to see another of the living statues standing there to torment him. But the only evidence of anyone having been there at all was a small golden candelabrum he'd just seen in the rose garden, now extinguished, with a tiny ribbon of smoke curling up from the smouldering wick. She thinks I'm a monster, he fumed. He felt his anger mounting, raging out of control as he stormed his way to the west wing. Monster! His claws gouged the wooden banister as he went up the long stairway, wishing it was flesh and blood, not splintering wood. Monster! There was very little light in this part of the castle. It was completely dark apart from the moonlight that came through the tattered red draperies of his bedroom. Leaning on the far wall there were stacks of different shaped mirrors covered in white moth-eaten clothes. Among the mirrors were portraits, some of which had been destroyed by his anger and frustrations, the visages mocking him as the witches had, taunting him with his former likeness. Monster! He couldn't light a fire in the staggeringly large fireplace, or the torches on the wall brackets. His paws couldn't master tiny things like matches, and the servants weren't allowed into the west wing. Not even the sisters came into this part of the castle. He had escaped their mockery for long stretches of time, when he spent most of his days here, in the beginning, hiding away, letting his anger swell to epic proportions, fearful of what he was becoming, yet intrigued too. It had been that way at first, hadn't it? Intriguing, the subtle differences in his features, the lines around his eyes that frightened his foes when he narrowed them, using a look rather than words to strike fear into his enemies, was very useful indeed. He had looked upon himself in the mirror in those days, trying to distinguish which sorts of deeds had caused the most horrific altercations in his appearance. Knowing that this was a degenerative curse that wouldn't abate, the sisters seemed to know of his compulsion and teased him about it, saying he would suffer the fate of their cousin's second wife if he wasn't careful. We don't know her. The sisters were always talking nonsense, always speaking in fragments, and suffered from fits of laughter so severe he hardly knew what they were on about most of the time. He wasn't sure even they were aware. Could it be the rambling of maddened minds? Here he was, taunted by insane crones, he who had once been a prince, and now he couldn't even venture out of his gardens to approach a wounded stranger, who might wander in from the forest into the castle for the night without sending him running in fear. What did Belle think of what little she saw of him in the dungeon torchlight? But he knew, didn't he? She called him a monster. Leave her to his servants, then. Let them weave tales of his dastardly deeds. Let them confirm how vile and ugly he was. He cared not. After all, he was a monster. And monsters knew not of feelings, especially the sentiment called love. His anger and confusion were quelled as his head spun from exhaustion. He sat on the bed, wondering what to do next. The sisters implied that the girl was his only hope of escaping the curse. Liars! He could make her fall in love with him easily if he looked as he once had, handsome, some might say arrogant. Women were easily managed then, a few flowery words of love, feigning some interest in what he had to say, perhaps showing a presence of vulnerability. And the girl was his. And often he didn't need to resort to such nonsense. Only if the girl was exceedingly beautiful would he try to bother with her admiration. Typically, his looks alone were enough to catch them spellbound. But the way he looked now, he had no idea how to go about it with Belle. He pushed himself onto his feet, reading the rough and tattered sheets, with pads and paws. Perhaps he should let the servants in to make the bed, dust the windows and mop the floors, to have him live more like a human being than the monster he'd become. He stood on his shaking legs, still dizzy from the rush of animal anger he'd felt when he heard Belle call him a monster. He moved to the mantel, where he had kept the enchanted mirror the sisters had given him long before. He stood there for a moment, taking a deep breath before he looked at himself. It had been far too long since he'd seen his own reflection. He had to see how his odious deeds had etched themselves upon his face. His paw rested on the sheet that was draped over the frame. Then, in one moment, he tore the sheet away and tossed it aside, revealing the looking glass and the tarnished reflection that stared back at him. Monster. The only indication of what he had once been was his soulful blue eyes, which teemed with humanity. Those hadn't changed. They were still his, but in all other respects he had become exactly what he feared, and indeed it was worse than he could have ever fathomed. His knees buckled as the world started to close in. His scope became narrower and narrower until he found himself in utter darkness, spiraling into a vision of his past, of himself as he had once been, before he became a monster, before he became the beast. Alright, that's the end of chapter 2, which means we've read 20 pages together. I think that was okay. I'm a little bit into it, but it might take me a while to get into the story, but I definitely enjoyed reading with you. I hope you enjoyed listening to me. I made a couple mistakes, and I do apologize. I'm not sure how this video is going to turn out, but if it turns out well, maybe I'll do another. I have that Mistress of Dark Evil Maleficent book that I could read as well. Like I'm saying in every video, do let me know what you want to see. Thank you for the recent support on any videos. I really do appreciate it. And I will see you in the next one.